Hi, everyone. We are about to get started in another 3 minutes, so quickly grab lunch and find a seat. We still have some open seats up here. If not, the overflow room is available in Innovation Forum. Sound the mic. One more. Testing. Yeah. All right. Okay. I think so. Yeah. Let's do this. Good afternoon and welcome to the 2025 How We Think Forum. Thank you all for joining us today. This year we're delighted to explore the topic of the polio vaccine, a landmark in global history, through an interdisciplinary lens. I'm thrilled to be joined by an outstanding panel of colleagues who will share their perspectives and expertise. Dr. Zara Tarani, a molecular biologist, Dr. Catherine Dilworth, whose expertise is in philanthropy studies, and Dr. Anish Vinayak, a historian. I'm Dr. Dwayne Jengeli, a political scientist and a faculty member here in the JMHC. It is important to know that none of the panelists are polio scholars, but we are here to demonstrate the process of interdisciplinary dialogue. Our format is simple. Our panelists will offer insights from their perspectives and their disciplines. Then we'll open the floor for your questions, whether in person or via the live stream. You can also use the QR codes at your table to submit your questions and comments. We encourage you to actively engage. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize Dr. Pete Moore from the John Martinson Honors College Print Bay for creating a stunning print of the 1957 US polio vaccine. You should all have it here. And the stamp was designed by Charles R. Checkering, created it shortly after significant medical advancements in combating polio. It symbolizes a turning point in public health. As a token, we have printed one for all of you, and we also encourage you to utilize the lines on the postcard to give your thoughts. If you haven't visited the print bay, I highly recommend it. They're doing incredible work. Polio is not just a historical story, it's a reminder of a critical need for public health interventions and coordinated global action, an interdisciplinary approach if you ask me. The attempts to eradicate polio required a massive collaborative effort demonstrating the power of science, community mobilization, and governance. As we've seen in recent years, public health challenges such as pandemic demands both local commitment and international cooperation. These connections between public health and global governance provide a rich framework for today's discussion. The How We Think Forum embodies the JMHC's commitment to interdisciplinarity. We value the depth of individual disciplines, but also recognize the power of collaboration in tackling complex, wicked problems. By combining diverse perspectives, we can ask deeper questions, embrace new challenges, and generate innovative solutions. With that, let's dive into today's discussion. We decided on polio as the focus of the forum. So what were your initial thoughts when you saw the object? I'll start with you, Dr. Tarani.
Well, my initial thoughts were to ask general observation questions. So the first question I asked was, what is the polio virus? So poliovirus is an enterovirus, meaning it infects the gastrointestinal tract when ingested through contaminated food, water, or hands. But it can also be spread to other parts of the body, which makes it especially dangerous. The next question I asked was, how does the poliovirus infect humans? So infection begins when the poliovirus enters the body through the mouth and travels to the intestines. There it will infect the intestinal lining cells. So once the virus injects its genetic material into the intestinal cells, the virus will replicate itself in the host cell and then rupture out of the host cell, releasing into the gut. And most of the time, about 90% of cases, these viral particles will be confined to the gut. And they will be excreted from the body through the feces with no symptoms to the infected individual. And that allows transmission to unvaccinated individuals in the population if there are no proper sanitation systems in place. Now, sometimes, in about 8% of cases, the viral particles will linger in the space around the infected cells. And so what happens is these viral particles will get swept into the lymphatic system. And the lymphatic system then dumps into the bloodstream, and then the bloodstream spreads the viral particles throughout the body. And in rare cases, in about 1% of infection cases, the virus will cross the blood-brain barrier into the central nervous system. And once there's less than 1% chance that it will get into the spinal cord, and for some reason, it likes to infect motor neurons. So these are the nerves that control voluntary muscles. And so as a result, the individual gets paralytic poliomyelitis, which is characterized by paralysis in the limbs and in the respiratory system.
Okay, so now let's look at this polio vaccine from the perspective of philanthropy. So my first encounter with the polio vaccine would have been my own inoculation as a baby, but the first one that I remember was not as a scholar, but as a parent, watching my son's pediatrician administer his first dose. At that moment, it was simply another routine vaccination in his pediatric schedule, and an expected, even mundane part of ensuring his health. But from my perspective in philanthropy, what strikes me now is how this vaccine represents one of philanthropy's most profound achievements, one that has nearly eradicated polio from the world. So I have two elements that I want to bring to your mind to think about this impact. So the first one is the power of grassroots giving. This was seen in campaigns during the 50s by the March of Dimes. They mobilized millions of small donations to fund the research for this vaccine. In addition, between 1951 and 55, they ended up raising $200 million in the 50s. In 1954, we have an example of an extreme and remarkable volunteer group, and it was a group of children whose parents volunteered them to test the Salk vaccine. This is and continues to be one of the largest volunteer movements ever in the US during peacetime. So that's the past, but it's impacted the future. And I think I see it in the evolution of what we call strategic philanthropy. So this is exemplified by global partnerships by people like the Rotary International, and the Gates Foundation, for example. Their collective investments continue to push polio towards eradication. Rotary and Gates, along with many other organizations and governments and communities, has resulted in nearly 3 billion children being immunized, and it's decreased the cases of polio in the world by 99%. So this vaccine connects historic philanthropy of ordinary citizens with today's large-scale, data-driven philanthropy. In many ways, it represents philanthropy at its best, unifying people across time and geography for a singular life-saving cause. However, philanthropy also plays a role in vaccine misinformation and resistance, illustrating the dual nature of charitable giving. It can both mobilize support and amplify opposition.
Thank you. Dr. Vinayak?
All right, thank you so much, Sarah and Catherine. Lots of threads, I think, to pick up on. My own discipline is history. We start in a variety of different ways. When I first honestly brought up the polio vaccine as one of the objects that we could consider, it was because of a news story in the middle of the ongoing war crimes and horrors that were happening in Gaza. One little footnote story there was about how polio had reemerged among children in Gaza during this time, and how difficult it was for vaccination drives. So that was one of the reasons why the polio vaccine was on my mind. The other image that came to mind with the polio vaccine was this one. That's what the polio campaigns, and there were a lot of polio campaigns happening in India, where I grew up, when we were younger. And I'm going to encourage you, and we're going to return at some point to looking at the imageries that are on this slide and comparing them to some of the other imageries that you've seen, including the one on your sheets, on your little cards. Now, this goes to one of the big divides within the area of history itself. Historians will sometimes view with suspicion folks who are too connected to the present, a kind of sense that you're not doing good history if you're kind of too engaged with the present. I tend to fall in the opposite side of this camp. I tend to be someone who always likes to connect my work, my research with the present in a variety of ways. But in every instance, we have to kind of transmute these questions of what are our initial motivations into historical research questions, into questions for historical inquiry. And there you start to connect with kind of three of my disciplinary and academic kind of interests. So one would probably relate to global politics. And even starting from that story of Gaza, or talking about this polio eradication campaign, you see two different modalities of global politics there. The modality of war, peace, justice, conflict, and presumably with big global challenges, one around cooperation that is important, not least for something like the climate crisis and stuff like that. We're not going to solve these questions without a framework of global cooperation of some sort. So that's one place that I would be interested in looking at the polio vaccine from. There's a really fascinating story that I found there. So that's one element of this. The second, I'm a historian often of the political economy. I'm always interested in how are things paid for. Is this a disease of the rich, or is this a disease of the poor? Does that affect who and how and where we see people turning up in this? Who acts? Who's doing the curing of polio? Is it the state? Is it philanthropic institutions? Is it private entities? Who's doing all of these? And these are kind of stock questions of a social and economic history of something like a polio vaccine. And then finally, the cultures of the vaccine, right? In this case, I'll talk a little bit about a visual culture of the vaccine a bit later on, but that might be a big social mobilization like this is going to generate a culture around it, a way of thinking about what does it mean for all of us to be in this together. And that's like catnip for historians. They love materials like this that are asking large numbers of people to think in some way about a question like this. So I'll leave it there, and we can circle back around.
Sure. Thank you for sharing your initial thoughts on the object. It brings me to the next question for today, and is related to an interdisciplinary understanding. So what insights from your perspectives, your backgrounds, or disciplines might be most valuable to an interdisciplinary understanding of polio?
So both of my colleagues here mentioned the campaign to eradicate polio through vaccination. So if I may, I'm going to take a moment here to explain sort of the biology behind polio vaccine and how it works, so that we understand the risks and the safety issues involved. Okay, so the first polio vaccine was developed by Jonas Salk in 1954, and this vaccine uses an inactivated virus that is injected into the muscle. Even though it's using an inactivated virus, the immune system can still detect it, and so it will produce IgG antibodies in the blood to provide systemic immunity. So what that means is people who receive the injected Salk vaccine, if they're later exposed to polio, they are still going to get gut infection. And so they are still going to shed the polio virus in their feces, which allows transmission to unvaccinated individuals in a community where maybe poor sanitation system is not in place, where there is a low vaccination rate. Okay, so there is this issue. Now, the second type of vaccine is the Sabin vaccine. So you can see that on this side of the screen. This vaccine was designed to address the issue of transmission. So it contains an active virus, but it's been attenuated. So it's been genetically modified to be weakened. Okay, so it's no longer, it's active, but it's not pathogenic. So this is administered through drops, usually 2 drops in the child's mouth. So it's orally administered. And this allows the active but weakened virus to infect the gut and stimulate a different type of antibody production called IgA. So this creates gut immunity. So you have 2 lines of defenses here. You have gut immunity, and then you also have systemic immunity, okay? Now, people who receive the oral vaccine, if they're exposed to poliovirus, they don't get polio infection in the gut, and therefore they don't shed live poliovirus in their feces. And so there is no risk of transmission to unvaccinated individuals in the community, okay? So this leads to more herd immunity. So with this in mind, we brought up this issue of eradicating polio. So I think from the scientist perspective, to eradicate polio, there is a need for public trust in the vaccine's safety. That's essential. And each vaccine, no medical intervention is free of risk. Each vaccine has its own risk, but they happen in rare instances. So in the case of the injected vaccine, Let me go to the next slide. Oops.
No, you gotta go.
There we go. In the case of the injected vaccine, if the manufacturer, for example, doesn't mix the chemical in the right concentration or for the right amount of time with the live virus to inactivate it properly, inadvertently, there could be some contamination of some vaccine batches with active virus, right? So therefore, we have testing of each vaccine batch to avoid this. On the other hand, for the oral vaccine, the virus is weakened through genetic modification, but there is a potential that when it's replicating in the gut, a mutation is acquired where the virus reverts back to a pathogenic state. So this creates the possibility of vaccine-derived poliovirus, which is extremely rare to have this mutation event, but we have been seeing it pop up globally in areas with low vaccination rates right now and poor sanitation systems. So how we intersect, I think with historians can offer valuable insights to scientists by shedding light on the historical events that have shaped public concerns about vaccine safety. I think with nonprofits, they can play a pivotal role in addressing these public concerns by assisting scientists in transparent communication about these risks, but also explaining in accessible terms the rigorous manufacturing protocols and the independent peer-reviewed clinical trial testing that have been designed to safeguard against these risks, and as well the oversight from global public health organizations.
Okay. Dr. Dilworth.
Thank you. That sounds like a great project. So if we apply philanthropy to the polio vaccine in terms of the different disciplines that kind of come to the fore, just within the work of philanthropy itself, there are really three specific missions that would be brought together in this case and have been, and that is number one, charitable giving, public health, and also social movements. So even this work, it doesn't function just because of giving, for example, or volunteering, which is often what is given the most attention. So to that end, in this role, we have a variety of agendas in philanthropy. And so the first is scaling. And in this case, scaling the vaccine distribution, which I've already mentioned the March of Dimes and the impact they had in the development of the vaccine, and then also the distribution and just the PR really about it. Today, with big organizations like Rotary and the Gates Foundation focusing primarily on polio, they're really demonstrating the shift from kind of a grassroots to something much more complicated, complex, arguably impactful as they spread across the globe. The other thing that philanthropy, another role that it has in scaling, is fueling kind of on-the-ground logistics, and that's often in the form of training local health workers and, hopefully in the near future, putting those talents and energy behind building institutions and infrastructure for healthcare in the areas where they work. The other thing that they do in a situation like this would be advocacy and also volunteerism. And so with advocacy, it's about raising public awareness, influencing policy decisions. That's something that people often don't know is a part of the nonprofit sector and actually think, oh gosh, that may actually be not their place to do that. But the nonprofit sector is precisely the place where advocacy that affects law happens on a regular basis. And then with volunteerism, which is really a cornerstone of philanthropy engagement, I think, across the world, volunteers provide everything from logistical support to community education and even direct services when it comes to the polio vaccination. Volunteers, for example, are often the ones going door to door, ensuring that vaccines reach children in remote and underserved areas. And finally, As I introduced in my previous discussion about philanthropy and the polio vaccine, philanthropy is also a battleground for the two sides of this issue, support versus opposition. So just as philanthropy has fueled the development of public trust, it has also leveraged to oppose vaccination efforts. Anti-vaccine movements have been funded in huge amounts by private donors and by foundations, often spreading misinformation through social media, public campaigns. And again, this dynamic, this push and pull really illustrates a broader reality in philanthropy that is also not considered very often, that for every cause that seeks to advance the public good, another faction often works to resist it.
Thank you. Dr. Van Eyck.
Thanks. A lot there, and again, I'll pick up on some threads. Historians are, well, they sit on the precipice of two possibilities. In India, where I come from, history is often seen as a social science. It's usually in the social science department. Here in the West, most places that I've been to, history is seen as a humanities. Now, this creates an interesting dynamic. Folks from the humanities and that humanities part of history is really interested in story. And the Salk-Sabin competition, for instance, is a great story. We're always looking for little nuggets, little ways of telling a story in that fashion. And what I was reading when I started kind of researching about this, about Salk and Sabin, is quite interesting. Salk was seen as this upstart, not particularly well-connected, kind of scrappy little nothing in the science profession. And that kind of translated as opposed to Sabin. Sabin was super well-connected, accepted as brilliant, at the head of a lot of institutions. You know, when Salk is putting together his project, Sabin is one of the people being asked, and Sabin is in competition with Salk, and that kind of inflects how permissions are coming through into the vaccine development, and the vaccination process, and the testing process. It's a fascinating story. It's a story also that interweaves with that geopolitical framework. So America developing the vaccine for polio was partly because America was one of the worst affected countries of polio in the 30s and 40s compared to most advanced places in the world. And, but also because, you know, this is a test of American science, as lots of things at that point of time did. And both Salk and Sabin were located in America, interestingly enough, in the Midwest, Cincinnati and Pittsburgh, I believe. So in the middle of this story, Salk gets ahead. And that technique of his of inactivated vaccines are kind of seen as, oh, that's not really science. That's not the cutting edge. That's like yesterday's type of way of approaching something. And Sabin very much has this attitude, and his approach to this live virus approach is actually the cutting edge of science, and that's the main thing. Well, he gets beaten to the punch, and America starts to adopt Salk's vaccine, and so by the time Sabin develops his in 61, well, he can't test it in America, so where's he going to test it? It ends up that the USSR has sent over a delegation of scientists to find out about this, and Sabin ends up doing a mass test of about 10 million people in the USSR. And the USSR then starts to take this massive leap in terms of polio eradication and so on, while well, it's an interesting story, but needless to say, like a lot of things, it gets caught up in the Cold War story, and that makes for an interesting description, not least of scientists as not just brains in a lab. They're competing for resources between the March of Dimes and the National Scientific Institutes, and for influence and so on. And all of this plays into what technology actually gets rolled out and how technologies get viewed. And by looking at that history, actually, you get a really interesting insight into all of this. okay, I'm gonna leave that set of things, this global and how it might intersect with the science on one side, and pose kind of pick up a little bit about this political economy question. If there's one thing or one other thing that Salk is famous for, apart from this polio vaccine, it's his answer to the question of whether he would patent this vaccine. And his answer is a really memorable quote. It is, "Can you patent the sun?" And the idea that he was saying is, this is collectively generated knowledge that we are kind of working through together in some way, and this is for the benefit of humanity, so why would I want to patent this? And Sabin as well, he didn't patent his works, and neither of those two pioneers patented their vaccines, part of what allowed for them to be distributed in this massive way. And then I look at philanthropy today, and in fact, Bill Gates' foundation is very, very invested in a really tight IP regime. Not so surprising for Bill Gates, whose money is, quite a lot of it is made based on IP, Microsoft and so on. And it makes for an interesting contrast globally of kind of how this political economy has moved, who has power, what are the ways in which money distributes, what are our understandings of how we fund science and what science is for. It just makes for some fascinating little threads there, I think. So I'll leave that.
Oh, thank you so much. This has been fascinating so far. We want to get to our final question. If we could wrap this up in about 5 minutes collectively so we can open it up to you guys. I wonder if we were to revisit an investigation. We have these wonderful students here who are often looking for research opportunities. So how might you go about investigating these ideas that you've suggested here, or further questions within your disciplines? Kind of what kind of steps would you want to take to get a topic going, and how may you probably include some of our wonderful students here? What would that process look like?
So I think it would be important to investigate how the virus mutates so that a better vaccine can be developed to prevent vaccine-derived poliovirus strains that we're seeing right now pop up around the world. So the first step I would take is to study the virus's genome, analyze regions that are hotspots or prone to mutations by looking at samples that have been collected from the recent outbreaks, and then assemble an evolutionary tree to track changes.
That sounds really good. So I have one that I really hadn't thought a lot about until I started looking recently at the polio vaccine. But my interest in this area, and something I would love to do research with students, is looking at the invisible connectors between those who want to do something to help and the outcome. Who are they? What are they? How are they describing this issue? Is it an informed discussion, for example? So I feel like that's a real missing link we haven't looked into. And then probably not surprisingly, since you've heard me talk about it a couple of times, with this phenomenon in the nonprofit sector where you do hold strong positions and invest an incredible amount of charitable giving into both sides of an issue, I would really love to do some analysis to kind of see who ends up winning in the end.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so the question about how do you investigate anything for a historian always goes back to the sources. And by sources, we mean really what are the materials that are generated by a particular activity, whatever that activity happens to be, that we can, many years later, look at those sources and intuit back about what was going on in people's minds and so on. I've talked a bit about global politics. I've talked about political economy. I'd mentioned visual culture. And so I thought for this last answer, I'd kind of suggest to you a couple of different kinds of sources that you should look at these two images in conjunction with the one that's on your little cards, right? So if you look at the image on your cards, it's a very classic kind of image. It's got this allegory of that's coming from kind of this classical tradition of how you describe things, particularly prominent in the West, but has also via the West and colonialism come into a bunch of other places. So that's that allegory of kind of health and the female figure sitting there. And then two children who kind of look like the cherubic white children that you might expect in a stamp nationally in the US in the 1950s. Now, 1943, so slightly earlier than that, you can see a very different imagery that's being circulated here. Now, obviously, that's a stamp. This is a cartoon. This is also for public consumption. This is a public message in order to support research that's happening. It's actually from the March of Dimes. That image by Charles Alston. Charles Alston, out of the Harlem Renaissance, a very interesting cartoonist himself in many ways. But I would do some kind of comparative study of, what are the different visual cultures among different communities? Who's imagined? It always seems to be children that are at the center of polio campaigns. But what do those children look like? What are the ways in which they're represented? Who are the heroes of a story? Who are the victims of a story, and so on? I'd also go back to kind of the contrast with the visual from 2024. This is from last year. Now, since 2014, India has been polio-free, has been declared polio-free. So this is kind of a similar moment as the 1957 moment, if you like, right? Well, similar in some ways. That image of yours is declaring a kind of significant victory, or the sense of a victory. This advertisement is saying, let the victory over polio continue, right? 2014 is when India is declared polio-free, but it's still saying, no, there's still more, there's still more, there's still more, there's still more. And it recognizes that this kind of a public health effort has to have this kind of push. Notice also how it's depicting a whole bunch of different sorts of people. For anybody who's not into Bollywood, this is the biggest Bollywood star for about 3 generations, I'd say, of Indian people, right? So this is a really, really massive Bollywood star, one who's also very connected to the current Indian government. So it's an Indian government advertisement there. But look at the medical aim there. A figure that might look like a doctor, suited man sitting at the back, is kind of at the back. It's kind of this worker, this healthcare worker who's not the doctor, who's front and center. Together, of course, with these 2 drops. So the Sabin vaccine is the one that's in the middle of this image. And this mother-child bond that seems to be very, very critical. So there's a very interesting narrative there about how the state needs to continue a push and who's involved in kind of pulling together for this effort and the kind of story being told by an image like this, even compared to the images that you all have. So that's some of the things that we would probably get to.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vinayak and Dr. Dilworth and Dr. Tarani. We have lots to talk more about, but it's not only about us, it's about you. So we would like to use the remainder of our session to turn it over to you. We'll have some microphones available. Dr. Bright will be here. Yeah, let's get some questions from the audience, and we'll also be checking the QR codes as well, but some questions right away, so that way we can have an engaging discussion for the remainder of the time. And in the meantime, thank you guys. Yeah. So put your hand up, yeah.
Just put your hand up if you have a question. I'll also come back and check the QR codes when I can.
So you said that polio is, in fact, very close to being eradicated, but it is not yet. Why do you think that is, and what are the final steps in different fields that we need to take to see the eradication of polio?
Whoever wants to talk about it first. Yeah.
Well, I'm jumping.
Go ahead.
I mean, I think that it's a lot of it is just still, there's fear. Speaking from the philanthropy side, and there's actually a lot of information that's being distributed to fuel that fear. And then I would say that would be the case maybe here in our country. And then across the world, it's just there's more work to be done to get the vaccine distributed everywhere. Anything to add to that?
Well, I just think if we look at where we're seeing it pop up, it's in countries that have been impacted by war. And so when you have low vaccination rates and you don't have the robust sanitation system, you have the risk of outbreaks.
It's a great question. It's a question that I can take in one of 2 or 3 ways. One of which is, yes, it's Pakistan, Afghanistan, a number of countries in East and West Africa, now Palestine. There was a few cases in other locations. Many of these are basically state systems, other kinds of systems that have broken down as a result of war and conflict, and you're not going to be able to get people there. And it's not helped by the circumstances of that war and conflict. So when Osama bin Laden was discovered, there was a series of covert operations that went before it. One of them involved American CIA operatives posing as hepatitis B vaccinators. And so they participated as vaccinators and provided one dose of the vaccine that allowed them to go house to house to house without drawing suspicion, and then kind of vanished from that area, and that was part of what helped them identify where Osama bin Laden was located. Now, the impact that had on the public health initiative was actually devastating because it further eroded public trust in these vaccinators who are coming to our houses, who have access to our houses and things like this. The US in 2014 had to declare voluntarily that it would never again use vaccination drives as a way of conducting covert operations. So that conflict itself, actually, it's an incredible little detail there, but yeah, absolutely true. The more interesting way, let me say, I enjoy, for those of you that have been in class with me, I like throwing out wicked questions. The more interesting question that's often posed by some public health experts is, should this be our effort at all? There's a very tiny number of cases. Polio eradication efforts are drawing in massive amounts of money, continue to draw in massive amounts of money, and they're not close to being major public health initiatives. A lot of that money comes in the form of kind of one-off volunteer drives. They don't necessarily strengthen public health systems in these places. And so is this way of addressing this goal, and is this set of goals, this very tightly identified goal of polio eradication, is that even the right goal to have? There's a third thread that I've encountered, which has to do with saying the majority of cases that have reemerged are to do with vaccine-derived polio cases, and I'm gonna lob it towards Zara at some point, perhaps, if she wants to take on that. But the largest majority of cases that are still around come from the Sabin vaccine's very, very, very rare side effects. And so a lot of folks are saying we should be putting more money into ensuring that we use the Salk vaccine everywhere instead of simply using this other one because it's cheaper. And that's what's been at the heart of public health campaigns and things like this. So many threads that you can pick up and pull on out of this that, again, connect up with a lot of these things.
Cool. There's a number of questions also, thank you so much, coming through on the via the QR code while Dr. Bright looks for another in-person question. I'll just read out one of them, and sorry if we don't get to all of your questions. Here's one. How do you think the privatization of health companies and philanthropy helps or hurt the spread of disease, and would public governmental support help?
I'm gonna respond in a way that maybe might be a little bit unexpected. You know, we're studying philanthropy and nonprofit here in my classes and getting to understand how these organizations work and why people give. People give to things that they're interested in giving to. And that, because that is kind of what's behind their interest in participating at all. And so, although these intermediaries that I'm very interested in looking into, which also includes fundraisers, which I've been before, and certainly have been in situations with donors where I have made an effort to kind of move their idea around, but maybe to something that was more meaningful. But that isn't always the case, and probably not often the case. So trends, kind of belief systems, political ideologies, all of these things are very much embedded in how people take action in philanthropy. And so I think that is probably something you haven't thought about as a reason, is that these are individuals making decisions about where they want to put their money.
Okay, all right. We could go to another question. Do we have another question in the audience? Yeah.
Hello. I was going to ask, what role and responsibility do you think that academics have in ensuring and avoiding like academic gatekeeping and avoiding, I don't want to say like, I don't know, like keeping their, not research just grounded, but also like accessible to people who need to hear it, not just to people who need to make the vaccine, but like making the findings accessible and prevent disinformation and distrust.
So you mean like the mission of Purdue as a land-grant institution, right?
Sorry, you're the one who brought up about the communications. You ought to talk about it.
Yeah. So I think it's really important. I think scientists aren't great at communicating. I think they mostly are confined into their communicating within the scientific community, and I think they need to do a better job to come out of their labs and learn a very important skill is to be able to take technical information and translate it into in a way that anyone without a science degree can understand. And I think that's a really hard skill to develop, and I try to do that in my classes where students are forced to sort of present research, their findings in an accessible way. And I think we need to do a better job. So that's one. I think we need to do a better job in the social media platforms. As one thing that I noticed during the pandemic was that there was a void from the scientific community, and that void was being filled by uninformed people. That creates a vacuum, and so the loudest individuals usually get spread the most effectively. So those are two regards I think scientists can step it up.
Cool. Anybody want to address this, or should I move on?
We have a lot of questions.
Okay, I'll come back to you, Dr. Tarani. There's a science one for here. How are viruses active without being pathogenic? What's the difference? Because I thought that those two words meant the same thing.
Okay, so when you inactivate a virus, you treat it with a chemical that basically freezes all of the proteins. So the proteins are no longer working, but the structure is there. So when it's in the body, the immune system can recognize it. With an attenuated virus or a weakened virus, you change the genome, you change a gene so that like one of the proteins that are essential for that virus to replicate is no longer being made, or it's not being made enough. So the virus can still inject its genetic material into the host cell, but it can't generate a large number of viral particles.
Okay, thank you. Audience questions? All right, I'll go back to the list because the list is huge. It's just coming here, and apologies if I haven't gotten to your question. Do you think that private philanthropy removes the burden of funding public health from the government?
I will respond that that is often the way it's positioned. And I think that individuals who are very passionate about healthcare, for example, really, really love to give to support it. The problem when you have activity coming from all points, in a country, for example, or the world, is it's really hard to organize it. It's really hard to structure how you make, how you set priorities, how you may respond to especially public health events is a really good example. So, it makes it more difficult. Having said that, when philanthropy moved over to the early U.S. from England, and we tried to kind of copy it, but not exactly the same way, it was positioned as an opportunity to shape the country in your own image, is actually how it was described. And that even if modern philanthropists don't understand that they were actually kind of given permission to do that at that time, they certainly do feel that way, acting out of, as I said earlier, their own motivations, often driven by faith, belief systems, certainly as it comes to giving in general, which is kind of the primary motivation still to this day in the U.S.
You want to respond to this?
Yeah, actually, I'm going to pick up on that and say that philanthropy portion, I think, I think that's really well answered, which is it's the whims of particular people that are being forwarded, and the main reason for the whims are because they have the money to back it up and things like this. I don't know whether that's the best model for how we should go about thinking. But I think there's also ambivalences on the public health side, because there's public health and there's public health, right? One of the reasons why the USSR could roll out this 10 million study, or the first country to eradicate polio was Czechoslovakia, was that they had a very tightly controlled public health system. It was highly centralized. It was also highly authoritarian, right? It's a public health system that generates a version of trust. I don't know if that's the version of trust that we want to have promoted and developed and so on, right? So that's a really interesting question, and I don't know whether the answer is that I think public health systems are going to be better than philanthropy. The US, unfortunately enough, tends to rely on philanthropy to supply the in-between space very often between what the market provides and what people can afford. It kind of expects the state not to step in there and private folks of various sorts to step in there. So philanthropy looms larger in the US than it does perhaps in many other countries. But in other countries, even with public health systems, the question of trust, the question of authority, the questions of how do we have patients and others relate to this system that perhaps serves them well in some kind of straightforward sheet ledger way, but one that in the long run can hurt if you don't have trust in the regime and trust in the state. And that's the more subtle question, I think, that we have, both with respect to, if you like, going back to an earlier question, to my mind, the question of trust is not a simple question of science communication. I think the question of mistrust is a much wider question, and it has to do with some of these systems. It has to do with how well people feel in general, not about health in particular, but how well people feel about their lives. How are they connected to other people? Are they in community? Do they like the fact that they're in community? Or are they constantly living in a kind of individualistic, suspicious atmosphere? If you're constantly living in an individualistic, suspicious atmosphere, you're going to mistrust. That's what it says on the tin. And then that mistrust is not down to how well you communicate the science. That mistrust is down to how that society is generating community or not, and things like this.
Okay, all right.
So I just want to add
Quickly, yeah.
quickly that I agree with your point there, because even if you understand the science, if you have concerns that maybe like the FDA or the World Health Organization has been compromised by individuals from big pharma, then even if you understand the science, you're not going to trust the product or vaccines.
Thank you. I'm going to amalgamate a couple more questions as the last one, and then we can all hang out afterwards. But what are some parallels from polio and COVID-19? Also moving forward, what lessons from the polio vaccine story? I'm trying to merge that together. If we can get a quick reaction from the panelists here, and yeah.
Well, the one that just comes to mind right now is the misinformation and mistrust about vaccines. We saw that during the pandemic with COVID-19 and the concerns about how quickly the vaccine was developed. And now we're seeing some questioning of the safety of the polio vaccine with the new administration.
In philanthropy, there's actually a pretty stark difference between the polio vaccine and COVID in fundraising. So as you've already heard, there was a lot of fundraising, a lot of activity, giving and volunteering, and fundraising dropped through the floor during COVID. And we kind of think it was just, people were just kind of trying to wait things out and see how the world was going to go. But it was very stark as it relates to giving at that time.
I'm going to lean into the difference and take one more shot at Bill Gates. Bill Gates, during the COVID vaccine, told Oxford University to IP up its developed vaccine and pair with AstraZeneca. So that's an example of him actually actively shaping as a form of ideology how a vaccine is developed and brought to market and things like this. And the result was actually that those patents weren't opened, countries could manufacture them freely, a lot of things happened as a result of this. But anyway, I would say, broadly speaking, the parallel that I would pick, there are parallels as well. I think the parallel that I would pick is we are facing a global moment where we have shared global challenges, right? So climate change is the biggest, most complex one of them, right? Often when you're studying climate change and you want a good story, you turn to the story of chlorofluorocarbons, right, CFCs, and how the Montreal Protocol was able to get everyone on board to replace the refrigerants so that we're no longer creating an ozone hole. You all probably didn't even grow up with the sense that the ozone hole is a problem. This was very much a panic, a hilarious panic. Actually, a friend of mine was told to sing songs about ozone and how wonderful. Anyway, those are big, complex global challenges. Getting vaccines out to people, just think about, we know what the disease is. We have the technology that we need to fix it. We can get it into everyone's hands. This is all possible. Like, these are all things that we can do. And not even all of those answers are there for the climate question. So if we can't solve, and we haven't solved either of these as global challenges, we collectively need to take a good, long, hard look at ourselves, I would say. So that's one parallel that I think is worth thinking with.
Thank you. Round of applause for our panelists today, please. I want to thank you for attending the 2025 How We Think Forum. Thank you to those on the live stream and the rebroadcast. And the panelists will hang out for a minute or so you can come and get your questions or comments in. And for those of you who wanted to know Dr. Vinayak's favorite Bollywood film, I'm sure he'll be able to tell you that in person. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for all the personnel behind the scenes. And I hope that we modeled somewhat of an interdisciplinary dialogue for you that you could use forward going in your classes, especially as you guys will have to do your own How We Think panel. And the next one coming up would be the Aronson panel. That's another opportunity for you. So thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.